All right, this is video 1 of Intro to Resolution Writing. Generally speaking, there are 3 parts to a working paper with distinct formatting. Each of these videos will discuss the key elements of each part, including the header, preambulatory, and operative clauses. Before we dive in, you should have this document open in front of you. It's the Resolution Paper Formatting Crash Course. You should either have it open on your computer, available in another tab, or print it out, whichever is easier for you. Hopefully you've had a chance to read or at least skim it. Keep in mind that all conferences and schools may do resolution writing slightly different, so be mindful of changes and be adaptable. This document included the punctuation and a lot of the simple formatting stuff that we will cover in this video. I think it would also be beneficial to have annotated what you think would be important from the discussion exercise. I've pulled it into a separate tab over here and highlighted what I thought was important. I broke down some of the things that mattered to me and how I felt would best shape this video. But I want you to keep in mind that there are a million different things that could be in play and may be valuable to different nations. The key is to be flexible. All right. So I went ahead and drafted it. First, the header. I pulled this information directly from the scenario at the end of the resolution crash course. We have first the committee name in italics right here. Usually that would be right at the top, and you would leave the space for the working paper, and then the dais would include draft resolution, but we will cover that later. So the first line that you're going to put is your General Assembly. That is where this one is taking place. It would be in both bold and italics. The second line would be the name of your paper in just bold. That's all that would be in there. You could put the abbreviation first. You could put the abbreviation last. You could put it like this. You could switch it around as long as the name of your paper is that second line. Moving on, we start to list the sponsors and signatories. Those are right here. The sponsors, again, I've pulled straight from the document, and I'll touch on a couple of the nuances for this in the final video of the series. Sponsors are the delegates who have contributed as a writer or helped draft ideas. Signatories, in contrast, are the delegates who want to see this paper make it to the floor for voting. The latter doesn't have to be for or against the paper. They just want to talk about it. With this in mind, there's sometimes a misunderstanding in committee where a required minimum of both signatories and sponsors causes some delegates to convince nations to drop their sponsor title and become a signatory. What I mean by that is when you're in the committee room, there are sometimes going to be a scenario where the dais will be like, hey, you need to have at least 3 sponsors and 3 signatories. Well, I have 4 sponsors and 2 signatories. Hey, Venezuela, would you mind dropping down to a signatory, even though you've contributed, because we just need to meet that standard? There is no reason for this. And instead, I think it would be smarter to insist to go recruit signatories from another group. You can either do this yourself if you feel your strength in the group is stable, or you can have a delegate who perhaps is looking for something to do to get this done. You can just be like, hey, Cuba, is it okay if you go over there and see if you can get some other nations from other groups to sign on to our paper as a signatory? That way nobody has to leave as a sponsor and you're not giving up anything. Like I mentioned before, there are so many different things that may be of value to put in a preambulatory clause, but the general formatting will be as follows. You'll have a couple of preamb zeros. These will be definitions that benefit your paper. In this case, it is our first 3 preambles. We have here a definition. This is not technically a definition, but I'm going to include it as a preamb 0 and then touch on why later. Remember, when we draft these preambles, the first word of every clause needs to be in italics. We also use italics for country names if we're going to mention them outside of sponsors and signatories, but this isn't very common. Here we're using words like define and noting as a way to better develop our understanding of the topic. Usually we'll pull definitions straight from official UN documents or NGOs, but sometimes we may want to amend the definition or perhaps have something to add from your moderated debates. I'm also going to advise to only use further note or further acknowledge or further anything if you are actually furthering the point in a relevant way. Make sure they connect. Don't feel like define child marriages as this, and then further defining the legal age group, because you want it to connect in a very relevant way. You want it to seem like it could be read together. Next, we'll start addressing anything we need to know for our first operatives. Generally speaking, our preams will be in sets. We'll have a set 1, which will be linked to our set 1 of operatives, so topic 1. What this means is when our operative clause is talking about education, so will our set of preams. And this, at least in the case of this scenario, we have our 4th and 5th line, or just the 4th one really, that addresses education and NGOs. You don't have to call out any NGOs in particular unless you think it'll make your clause stronger, but generally save them for the operatives. In this case, we have observing the positive effects of educational opportunities. Again, education, that is the focus of that first point. So we know that our first operative clause is going to be about education. We're not going to talk about health in that clause. We're not going to talk about, I don't know, climate change. It just isn't relevant. We want to focus on specifically educational opportunities to empower the rights of women and children, because that's what we want to talk about for not only child marriages as our committee topic, but also as our first strong operative. And since we have 2 operative clauses, we're going to have to draft a couple more preamps that'll better introduce the rest of the paper. Our second operative clause, which is way down here, don't worry about it yet until we get to the operative video. But the second clause that I've drafted is addressing infrastructure. So that means that we need to have preamps that address infrastructure. We have acknowledging not all communities can be reached by educational outreach and NGOs. This is a whole separate point from just education. What we're talking about here is rural communities, vulnerable populations, a lack of infrastructure. Those things are going to be incorporated in our second operative clause. So when you were doing this, it doesn't necessarily need to have the color, but if it helps you figure out what you're talking about and better visualize this, again, header, and then you go right into here where you have your preamp 0, your definitions, your little note on sovereignty. People like it when you talk about sovereignty. Then your first idea and your second idea, and then you can go right into your operatives, full force and strong. In the next video, we'll be diving right into operative clauses, and we'll talk about the different elements of a strong operative clause. But these are the things you need to keep in mind when drafting your preamps. And we'll talk more about the little nuances like word choices and, keeping things diplomatic in the final video of this series.